Hi everyone and welcome to Breaking the Spell. So if you are a regular viewer of our show, you'll notice we're in a new location here, and that's all thanks to our very hospitable and gracious guest that we are having today on our show, Kenneth Paul Tan. So Kenneth, thanks so much for being on our show.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for having us. And look, today we're going to talk about a book that Kenneth has written, and I have it here with me. This is my copy, Movies to Save Our World: Imagining Poverty, Inequality and Environmental Destruction in the 21st Century. So I'm just going to do a quick introduction, to Kenneth, in case you are a viewer who's not in Singapore, you may not know about him. So Kenneth Paul Tan is Professor of Politics, Film and Cultural Studies at the Hong Kong Baptist University. Previously, he was an Associate Professor at the National University of Singapore and US, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. He was Vice Dean of the LKY School during the most rapid and critical years of growth, and he served the senior leadership team for almost a decade. Look, if you are in Singapore, if you haven't heard of Kenneth Paul Tan, something's not right. You should know about him. He's kind of like a celebrity intellectual. Right? He's an academic all-rounder. He's got interdisciplinary expertise in political science, public management, policy studies, sociology, urban studies, cultural studies, film and media studies, and I imagine the list can go on, right? The other very important thing you got to know about Paul is that Kenneth is that he won several prestigious teaching awards, including NUS Most Prestigious Outstanding Educator Award for several years. So he's a wonderful teacher, obviously. Now, before this book, he's written other books, and those include Singapore's First Year of COVID-19, Public Health, Immigration, Neoliberal State, and Authoritarian Populism. Another book he has, Singapore Identity, Brand, Power, Cinema and Television. And this book, which I've read a long time ago from him, Renaissance Singapore, Economy, Culture and Politics. So, he's written so much, contributed so much to public discourse. We are incredibly grateful to have him. So first, let me just say, I'm really, really happy that you wrote this book. For me, as someone who loves to watch movies. And I think even more than that, what I like actually is that people talk about it and they deliberate about the themes and the ideas. And you've covered, lots and lots of movies, movies that are in the public limelight, from the US, from UK, South Korea. And I think that, to me, these themes that we're going to talk about, poverty, inequality, environmental destruction, they're so pertinent to what we're facing right now, and movies are a great vehicle to get us to talking about it. So what I'm going to do is in terms of my questions is I obviously read the book, so I have quite a number of questions on that, but really also what I'd like you to do is to relate our discussion to Singapore, within this region of the world where because many of the films could be based in the US, so we want to know how can we as outside, people who don't live in America, what can we take away from these films as well? And at the same time, I'm going to ask you a little bit about, stuff that's outside of the book. So maybe how you perceive and analyze things in pop culture, say the Marvel movies, and as well as maybe the politics of Hollywood and cinema. Yeah. So anyway, we have a standard opening question. So now it's your turn to talk. And my first question to you, as we always ask all our guests on our show, is when was the first time you realized something's not right with the world, things are not the way it should be?
Gosh, that's a good way to start an interview, but also a terribly difficult question to answer. Difficult because it lures you into giving an answer that could sound more heroic than reality would. Then that would be the case. In reality, I don't think I can identify a time in my life when I came to such an awareness. Right? If I sort of thought about growing up, for example, I'd say the feeling was more that this is the world, right? And my world growing up was Singapore, right? So Singapore was my world, and there were categories that defined that world. Boxes, if you like. Right? Singapore was very much a nation of boxes put together in certain ways. And my sense of that time growing up was I didn't necessarily fit so neatly into these boxes. For example, there were boxes that had to do with race. Right? You had to be one of 4 things: Chinese, Malay, Indians, or some catch-all other. And I think growing up as a child of a biracial couple, my father's Chinese and my mother was Eurasian, and even her lineage, right? Eurasian on the one side, German, Dutch, sorry, and on the other side, Portuguese. These boxes didn't mean a lot to me, and yet they were placed upon me as that, that sort of side of my identity that mattered in Singapore. And I guess not so much that the world wasn't right, but the world was like this, and I didn't necessarily fit so well into it. And it would happen when people would sort of ask me, Tan is your surname, right? Why are you so dark? Why can't you speak Mandarin? I couldn't, because I did Malay in school. So it would jar in that way, I think. So my sense of growing up was that, right? That how do you not feel that those boxes, how do you deal with the fact that those boxes didn't feel real to you or authentic to you, and yet somehow, in order to fit into this society, you had to make yourself these things at the right time, the right place. And when do you play with that, right? Because you can also play with it. So being an intercultural person living in a multicultural place, made you feel out of place, but at the same time allowed you to play with these categories quite creatively. I guess, come to think of it, when did I start to think of the world as maybe a bit not what it should be? Maybe when I was an undergraduate, I think. And I was a political science and economics undergraduate. And I think the very first text that I read, prescribed text, right, that I read was the most foundational you can think of, which is Plato's Republic. And my takeaway from that very famous foundational text was not so much what the form of the good is, right, or what the ideal society should be and how we should strive towards being those things. But I think what I took away from that text was the futility of trying to be something perfect. Plato obviously gives an account, right, a very well-developed account of what a good man or a just man should look like, and therefore what a just city should look like. And then very quickly after that, gives an account of how it degenerates, right, with military desires being succeeded by the desire for wealth, and then a certain kind of populist, anything goes society, right? Aimless, purpose, kind of, there's an aimlessness to it, a purposelessness to it, which opens the space for populist manipulation and demagoguery, right? And eventually tyranny. And I remember sort of, and again in my untutored mind, right, the first thing I read, right, as an undergraduate, my untutored mind said, gee, this sounds a lot like Singapore. Right? This notion of an ideal place, and yet to find the smartest people, academically speaking, the so-called philosophers, right, to be your kings, to rule over you so that reason, would prevail over appetites and would prevail over that spiritedness and all of that. And then you would have a stable and successful and I guess efficient society. And then to see, kind of the scholar class and the military class, right, the generals and so on, and to see, the rise of wealth and how wealth is so important in Singapore as a sign of respect, as a goal, right, an aspiration, a life goal for individuals as well as the nation that they're in. And then to grapple with that idea of democratization, right? Because we were thinking in those days of is Singapore going to democratize further? Talking about the 1990s, right? Liberalize more. So, it kind of signaled to me that if the world isn't the way it should be, and we want it to be something ideal, right? Chances are we're going to mess it up. Right? We're going to create this ideal country, this ideal society, whatever, and very soon human nature, history, time, accident, luck will come in and, kind of cause everything to unravel, and unravel to a point which maybe makes it worse than it ever was before. So I had that feeling, right? So growing up, the world is like this. I may not fit in it so well, but I can position myself, and here and there I can sometimes be what I don't feel I really am, but need to be, and so on. And then that sense that, okay, maybe you can change the world, but if you wanted to change it, and you change it to this blueprint of a utopia, right? This utopian setting, you might mess things up for everyone, and life could be even more of a hardship for everyone than ever before, right? And then I guess maybe the third moment was when I started teaching in the university, and I joined the National University of Singapore after my PhD, and I joined both the political science department as well as something we called the University Scholars Program that I think has seen the end of its natural life this year. Anyway, it was a place, the USP was a place that paid a lot of attention to teaching and experimental teaching. That was also the time of digital culture, so we were all encouraged as young assistant professors to think creatively about that learning space and to bring digital culture in. And my most immediate approach to teaching at that time was to look to films, right? And I was teaching courses in political science, political theory, and it seemed obvious to me that there were so many films out there that could do more than just entertain, right? They could be used very specifically to dovetail with more abstract theories, make them come alive in certain ways, but also provide an avenue for us to critique the theory as well. I mean, for example, right? I remember there was a course, I thought, where we read Hobbes' Leviathan, and we looked at Lord of the Flies as two sort of texts that resonated very the film version of Lord of the Flies, right? That resonated very nicely together and exposed the strengths and the weaknesses of either of each text. Right? Look at the film JFK to think about the nature of leadership, charisma, violence, assassinations, and what all of that means in political theory. So I was doing that sort of thing, and I guess that was probably a moment when the realization was, okay, you don't have to just conform to the boxes that the world gives you. Neither do you need to transform it into this singular, totalizing blueprint of what the world ought to be, which of course is going to degrade into something uncontrollable and terrible. But you can make small changes, right? You can make changes that involve authentic realizations, people reading a text, watching a film, and finding what this tells you about our condition, about what change is possible, what consequences changes could bring about too, right? Because there's a sense of responsibility that one has as well. And the humanization that happens or very often through movies, the humanization of theory, right, through movies, helps us to sort of be more empathetic, perhaps more compassionate about the consequences of our theoretical efforts to change the world for the better. So that's a terribly convoluted and self-indulgent
No, I think
elegant question.
No, I think actually, if anything, that's probably one of the most thoughtful but also all-encompassing answers, because I think it directly answers the question about when was maybe the first time you felt this way about the world, but also at the same time ties into why you wrote this book. Unsu, do you want to offer a question?
Yeah, I mean, that is such a beautiful answer, actually. Like, and you know, this is the reason why we asked this first question, because you know, it always has a way of opening up stuff. And I guess what I found myself wondering is, so you know, you talked about, yeah, using films to show almost as a mirror, right, for society to reflect back on ourselves, and how films can be used to show a lot of like different values that we might aspire to. And I wonder, do you think a lot of the films that we are exposed to today fall into a certain kind of formula of the hero's journey, which is a very Western-centric model, where, yeah, the hero, you know, encounters challenges and then eventually overcomes them. And actually, you know, going back to your sort of comment about Plato, like if you look at a lot of more Eastern approaches to storytelling, it recognizes that life is sort of cyclical and it's not like this, you know, linear progression. So yeah, wondering what you might comment on that.
Great question, great question. So many things in that question, right? Mirror, hero's journey, non-Western alternatives. Okay, mirror. Yes, films are in many ways mirrors, right? Because we look into them and we try to identify ourselves in, or at least the mirror invites us in to the movie and recruits us into these multiple positions that we could occupy. And depending on who you are in the audience, right, you might be a privileged member of the audience, so you might identify with the hero of that journey. And that hero may be racially marked, nationally marked, gender, or whatever it is, right? But the hero has a special place. The protagonist, which is a very classical idea, right? It drives the subjectivity that drives the narrative and drives the resolution of whatever problem there is in there. And we would like to be identified, or we would like to identify with the hero. And sometimes the movie allows you to, because the hero is very clearly marked in a certain kind of way. But it could also be that you're part of the audience who isn't reflected in the hero. Right? You could be the villain, right? Again, because marked, right? Because maybe you don't speak, because you speak English with a French accent. So you're that villain, right? And the movie recruits you into that space. And so how do we react to that? Right? Do we reject the movie? Do we enjoy the movie nevertheless? Or we might identify with inconsequential characters, of which there are often very many. Right? These characters might be consequential in the sense that they're victims, let's say. So the hero defends the victim against the villain, right? So who are you in this triangle of a relationship? Who are you there? Are you going to be the objectified victim? You identify with that person again because you're marked in a certain way, racially, gender, whatever it is, right? Or are you just a decoration on the set? You know, just the folks who have no bearing on the narrative. You are there to, you know, as no more than just as a prop. So there's a kind of singling out or a kind of sorting out of the audience into these kinds of roles, I think, that may reproduce certain hierarchies in our actual life. Right? So this mirror then isn't just a neutral mirror, right? It's actually reproducing the inequalities of our lives and saying, you, young person of this sexuality, speaks this language, adheres to this religion, you are like this, right? And then it goes back and reinforces. So I think there's a sense in which that mirror analogy can tell us something, or can at least suggest to us the need to be critical about films, right? Because they can really reproduce structures of inequality, even abusive relationships, exploitative relationships get reproduced and normalized. And that's the problem sometimes with movies that feed back and therefore normalize some of the distortions and the dysfunctionality of our actual world. However, films that are not so naturalistic, right? Films that experiment a little bit, films that are in a way mirrors but distorted mirrors, right? They can sort of highlight certain things about our lives, our natural lives, our real world lives, that are often hidden because they're so taken for granted. They're so habitual, right? We do it as a matter of habit. But when this distorted mirror of a film singles that relationship or that action or that belief or that way of talking out as something to be looked at carefully, it can help us to develop critical sensibilities. So I like the mirror thing, but the mirror can go both ways. It can normalize the injustices of our world, but it can also bring attention by distorting, right? Bring attention to those things that, you know, we never pay attention to, but they are actually at the heart of why people suffer in the world, right? People do badly in the world. Hero and the journey thing. I think, yeah, it's very embedded in I dare not say Western thought because I don't know enough to be able to say that, but it seems everywhere, right? Even the Hegelian idea of a subject, right, as history, in a sense, the spirit that unfurls, right? The reason that unfurls over time and space, and it's like a journey as well, isn't it? It's a coming home, right? And that however you want to think of it, the dialectic is that journey of, you know, meeting people who are different, meeting opponents, colliding with these opponents, or, you know, engaging with these opponents, and somehow or other some new truth or experience emerges, and that collection of experiences and new realizations takes us eventually back home, the comfort of home, the feeling of being back again to what we were supposed to be. I think it's in everywhere. It's in philosophy. It's in the way our stories are told, and we do often think of the hero, right? We like to lionize subjects, to in a sense almost one-dimensionalize these subjects because they tell a nice story. So you can imagine the appeal of that, right? The attractiveness of that. However, and this is the third point, right, which is there are alternative ways of storytelling that don't necessarily feature a particular kind of subject or a particular kind of protagonist or hero, and all their physical encumbrances, like male, white, you know, older, whatever. It doesn't have to be like that. Where the narratives are a lot more fragmented, a lot more circular. You know, the sequence isn't linear anymore. They one thing that happens in one part of the world, and something else that happens in another part of the world from another century can collide in certain ways in these more inventive films. I'm thinking, for example, of this thing that I recently saw. I keep forgetting the title. Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. Right? So that's a beautiful example, I think, that goes against, that is an alternative, right, to the hero's journey. And I loved it for that, right? For the way that using the vehicle of the multiverse and a metaphor for our fragmented selves and all of that, it kind of really challenges this idea of the singularly acting subject that learns and becomes complete, right, at the end. Challenges that, and a beautiful film like that isn't just cerebral and technical in its sophistication, you know, actually has a very nice feeling to it, right? There's love in that film, and I love movies that can sort of do that, right? They can play with your mind, can play with structure, can play with what the mind expects, right? And yet not alienate you, still be attractive and pull you in to the narrative, and then you feel this warm fuzzy thing at the end.
So a quick one, because we were in the car, Unsu has watched that movie, Everything Everywhere All at
okay,
Once.
yeah.
I think you might have a different take
Oh,
on
you
that
hate,
show.
you hate it, do you? Okay.
So do you want to give some feedback first
tell me,
before,
why do you
before
hate
I
it?
ask? Yeah.
Well, okay, but first of all, we forgot to lay some ground rules. We're talking about movies. Is there anything about spoilers, like, for the
Okay.
audience?
Oh yes.
Oh, yes,
okay.
true.
So
Can we?
Sorry, we should put a
Shouldn't,
disclaimer.
right?
No, I mean we are probably going into spoilers, but we will try to give you a heads up if we're going to go into there. So just to let you guys know, okay, who was watching the show. Okay, so go ahead.
Yeah, so
feel free to.
I might, accidentally
Yeah.
give a spoiler or whatever.
So this is for the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once.
And okay, another thing is my memory is really bad. So
Mine too.
like I sometimes I just really can't recall details. I sometimes I walk away from a movie just getting a general atmosphere,
Same here.
right?
Same here.
And I think this goes to another aspect of movies that I found. Like when I go into a movie where there's a lot of hype around it, the chances of being disappointed also goes up, right? And so,
True.
yeah, like going to this movie, I had heard a lot of hype. People were really raving about it. So I was actually.
But do you agree with his point that this movie has broken ground when it comes to perspective taking and structure? Like, is it that groundbreaking? Do you think that way? I think you can say that without spoiling anything.
No, I think that they did do a lot of interesting conceptual things with multiverses. Like I love science fiction as a genre, and so I think this movie kind of, took a lot of interesting science fictional elements. I think where I might be disappointed, and maybe this is something we can talk about. It goes back to the hero's journey. Is the hero's journey just has a way of creeping back in, even when a movie tries not to be about the hero's journey. Because I'm trying to remember, at the end of the day, there was something about the specific universe in which the Michelle Yeoh character, the one we started with, there was something special about her, and it's just like if you look at the Matrix, Neo, like he's the one, and I think there was some aspect of her being the one. There was something special that the other multiverses were trying to reach her.
Yes. No, I think you're right. I agree with you that one way to look at this is that instead of just asserting the specialness of the present, right? Instead of doing that, which many films do, this one takes you around the block a little bit, but you come right back to the same point and say, see, we're still back, and you are special, right? And the other possibilities, maybe a criminal even, right? Maybe a villainous and criminal and all. So it's true. But to me, good enough. Good enough that it at least breaks. I think at some level though, what would be the alternative, right? If a movie just...
Actually, I'm quite curious about that because I would like to ask both of you. Really, have you seen any movie that could break that traditional structure of storytelling? Because it seems to me you can't help it. It's quite universal. People need to go to a movie understanding who is the character they're supposed to root for. That's the way a lot of movie critics and reviewers go about evaluating the quality of a film. They'll say, okay, who am I supposed to sympathize with, right? And if you don't give me that character, they find it too messy and too convoluted. Yeah, so it seems like you got no choice about it.
In a way, right?
I actually have a suggestion. So it's not a movie, but it's a TV series.
Okay.
Game of Thrones. Have you seen Game of Thrones?
Okay, I have to admit, no, and very, very good reason. Because, it's like Star Trek, right? You can't just plug into it, right? You've got to
You
see
definitely
the
have
whole
to start
damn
from the
thing,
beginning,
right?
yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Game of Thrones is like that for me. I just don't have a year to put aside so then I just put it aside. Anyway.
Yeah, no, actually it took me a while to get into it. Like the first few times I watched it, I couldn't get into it because it was just too complicated, and then I had to read a bit of the books. Then once I got into it, I got hooked. But I think what really captivated or engaged audiences about Game of Thrones, was how main characters would just be killed off, right? And so I think in that way, it really disrupted the hero's journey because you build up, these characters, and then the show just kills them off, and so many of them, right?
Yeah.
And then also I think it really created this idea that the social political aspect was more important than any one individual.
Right.
And so I think the TV series actually tapped into a greater maturity that we're all having about the political systems that we live in, that sometimes they are all powerful and oppressive beyond what any individual can sort of overcome.
Okay, I've not seen it, but here's my cynical view of that, right? So from your description, one could also read it as this, right? This is this is the way the capitalist culture industry is, right? They recognize that viewers have only so much that they can pay attention to before they lose interest in something. So you constantly have to reinvent. You constantly, if you have something good that's going on for a while, before it comes to a natural end, you need to cut it off, right? So to leave the audience wanting more, the Seinfeld idea, right? You sort of quit when you're ahead, right? So same with characters that you're rooting for. Everybody's looking forward to this main character, protagonist, right? And so much has been invested into that protagonist, and you kill that person off, creating a kind of desire, right? Like who's going to fill that role, that role, who's going to grab our attention again, and that sort of, in a sense, re-energizes, reactivates the following, and perhaps it's not so much an alternative to a hero-centric narrative or journey as it is a eternal renewal, right? Knowing that the contemporary audiences can't pay attention to more than a certain amount, right? You get to keep renewing it. So I've not watched it, so I don't know, but I imagine each new central figure is probably marginally different from the previous one.
I mean,
yeah, no, I can see that. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, anyway, in Game of Thrones, because you don't know really, because you didn't watch it, but towards the end, it became kind of cliche, right? So there was a lot of criticism towards the later seasons because it went beyond the book, and the showrunners had to produce it on their own, and then that's where you see very traditional TV tropes and cliches fall in, and that's where people lost hope.
Okay,
Game of Thrones. I should say, by the way, we've talked so long, but we haven't even touched on the book yet. So I better try to go back to that. And kind of actually, you open with a really good, tale about philosophy, Plato, right? And I would just want to say to anyone who's going to read this book, right, you actually suggest to the reader to not skip the first chapter. And even though the first chapter is the most dense, but it is the one where you actually run through. The opening chapter is called "What is Wrong with Our World Today," right? And you went through this whole gamut of political and philosophical ideas from Plato to Marx to Hegel, Deleuze. There's just Michael Sandel. It's just really like a good encapsulation of where a lot of thinkers are right now in terms of analyzing where we are in terms of the world today. So I thought anyway, maybe we want to do a little bit of a 101 first. Because the main thing that you're trying to address in all these movies is, this state of neoliberal globalization or free market capitalism that we live in. And someone can watch these movies and still not understand that term. I've actually met, bankers or friends, who work in the finance sector and they don't even know what it's supposed to mean, neoliberal, capitalism. So I thought maybe just kind of a jump start, right? Like before we start talking about all the films and all the things that these problems, right? What's a good way of looking at it? What's a good way of kind of summarizing the problem? So I just help you a little bit because I think I like the way you said you stated the problem that despite us being told by political and economic elites that we're supposed to be living in a world of abundance and wealth, the truth is we still see so much poverty and inequality. So explain why that is the case to our viewers. Yeah.
Thanks very much. I mean, at the heart of this. The theoretical framing of this book, I suppose, is neoliberal globalization and responses to it, right? Political responses to it. And I don't think I'm saying that neoliberal globalization on its own is a bad thing, right? There are many things that are debased about it, but I also want to say that responses to the extremes of neoliberal globalization are also debased. And so it creates this space where, we see things like extreme polarization, the inability to communicate and to have enough shared values on which to base institutions and ways forward, right? Agendas to improve our condition, to improve the world, and so on and so forth. We don't have that basis because of the deep polarization that has resulted from the debasements of neoliberal globalization, and then authoritarian, populist responses, manipulative types of populism that have emerged in response to it. And I want to sort of highlight that that dynamic, right? That we've seen, especially in the last 20 to 30 years, as kind of characteristic of our age, and which sets us apart from earlier critiques of capitalism. I mean, that's what it is, basically, right? Capitalism is a necessary stage in our human evolution. Marx says so. And it brings a lot of good things. Right? Capitalism takes us out of despair, out of hunger, out of, we're able to use our ingenuity to satisfy our desires and our needs, to kind of transform the gifts of the earth, right? Gifts of nature, in order to satisfy our needs to an extent. And we live better. We live in potentially conditions of plenty and so on, and there's not really a need to fight over scarcity as such. And that sets up the problem, right? Because, technically we should just be moving towards a state of nirvana or something like that, right? It's like a state of plenty, no need to compete for things, just use the resources that we have wisely, and everyone has enough, and everyone gets to contribute according to what they're good at, right? And what they feel proud of, right, in terms of their contribution. But in this sort of empirical world where we do see advancements in technology, we do see a prosperity of a kind, right? And we do see, kind of reduction of conflict. Nevertheless, we're seeing inequalities emerge, new kinds of inequality, right? New kinds of conditions of poverty, the new poor, and all of that emerge in this space. And there's something irrational about it. So I guess the philosophical framework was to kind of begin with an account of progressive philosophy, in the sense of philosophy that tells us why things should get better logically. So, you will hear accounts, in the book you'll hear an account of Francis Fukuyama, who made the claim at the end of the Cold War, still, a respected claim, right, by many, that, we are all slowly but surely moving towards a kind of capitalist, liberal, democratic endpoint, right, at which we will all be equally recognized, and we will have enough to satisfy our needs, and so on. And that's a very optimistic view of history moving to something. And so the book sort of unpacks some of this thinking philosophically, but then also tries to reconcile this stage that we're in, right? If that's the case, how should we understand this current condition where, the world itself is divided between regions and countries that are exceedingly wealthy and those that are exceedingly poor, and even within wealthy societies, there are strata within them that live in abject poverty, right? So how to make sense of that? One way is to say, because this is all part of the plan, right? Slowly but surely, right? Reason will unfold, and spirit will unfold, and we will reach a point where those who are now in a poor place will rise and emerge, and so on and so forth, and we will still move to something better. So that's one sort of view, right? That's be patient. The be patient view, right? History will have its way, and things will be better in time. But I wanted to also entertain the view that perhaps capitalism has reached such a monstrous level that it's kind of derailed this process, if there ever was one, right? That has derailed this. And we're not necessarily heading to something better, we might be heading to something worse. And I guess although I don't talk about it so much in this book, or at all in fact, it is, I guess, the argument of the dialectic of enlightenment, right? I don't know, in Horkheimer's idea that in enlightenment also are the seeds of their own irrationality and destructiveness. And I guess I want to entertain that idea that this thing that we see as progress and that we feel and experience, many of us, right, as improvement in the world, has the seeds of disrepair and the seeds of irrationality that will lead us to some kind of deathly moment where if we didn't create a class of desperate poor who would rise up and destroy everything for everyone, right? If it wasn't that, then we would consume the world to such an extent that we would have no world to prosper in anymore. So is that kind of, I wanted to entertain that sort of idea by sort of pulling very specifically on the thinking of different thinkers, the ones that you mentioned and others, and to see if other thinkers might have had things to say which would be helpful, like Arendt, for example, right? And people generally who think that part of the solution might be political, right? That we need to revitalize the public sphere in some way, re-politicize it, right? And to bring authentic voices, original voices into this space so that we can think about great things, right? Rather than banal, trivial, right? Kind of animalistic things, right? But to think about something great. How do we save our world? And what could be greater than that, right? So to be elevated in this space. And of course the challenge to that is that this space has been fractured in for so many reasons, right? One is just the way in which the public has turned so private, right? We retreated from the public because we have only so much bandwidth and we would rather spend our days
watching movies.
Well, and maybe not even watching movies, right? But kind of making money and struggling to make money so that we can buy things, right? And if we had time left over, maybe watching movies. So it's kind of impoverished in that way. The public sphere is impoverished. Our exposure to the public sphere is often through media, cable news, right? That sort of feeds us with these very fractured accounts of what people are fighting for in the public sphere, very polarized accounts, and then you have to line up according to where your sensibilities might be. So rather than participate in a great conversation about what we want authentically, right, for our world, we see who the team leaders are, and then we hope either they pick us for their team, or we run to line up behind the team leader that we want. And that's kind of, really an impoverished way of recognizing the world. I think the book sort of sets that up. That's a very clumsy answer to your question, but there you are.
I just say as a quick rejoinder, I think that's what we are trying to do here. You talk about how we retreat to our private spaces, right? And I think how we want to make it, intelligible for our viewers that, a lot of us maybe, watch a movie, maybe get inspired by the movie, love the themes in the movie, but we just sit back at home and we just, sit in it and we don't do anything more than that. And, us on this, in this very session talking about it is also our way of trying to reclaim public space and have some kind of public dialogue about private, movie watching activities. You want to add something into this?
Nothing for now. I mean, I appreciate the summary of that first chapter. I think it gives me a good idea of where we can take this conversation. So
so look, the book, you have various essays. So I actually have questions for each of them, right? So the first one I'm going to go through is actually your essay on Michael Moore, right? And his, your title is a working class hero, and you review most of his films. So for people who don't know Michael Moore, it's very unbelievable if you don't. But if you don't know who he is, he's an American filmmaker. He's made many films like Roger and Me. The most famous one is Bowling for Columbine, Fahrenheit 9/11, and there's a sequel also as well, Fahrenheit 11/9, and sequel, and Capitalism, a Love Story. So he's this like working class populist documentary filmmaker, and you talk about how his documentaries are very powerful, and he has this very impressive ability to clarify complex relationships, communicate them very vividly, right? And the idea here is that he employs a variety of tools, as you mentioned: parody, satire, slapstick, melodrama. So I guess that's the thing I want to ask you, right? So a lot of his films have to do with the American capitalist system. So whether it's the failing healthcare system, the perversity of the gun culture. What I want to ask you is that for us here living in Singapore, anyone who doesn't live in America, what kind of takeaways can we get from watching his films? I love his films, by the way. I watch a lot of his films, and I have a lot more to say about him actually. But I just want you to kind of answer for anyone who hasn't considered him, right? Like, why do you think he's such an important figure to watch out for? Yeah.
Okay. Well, he's important for so many reasons, right? Not least of which is the reason that he's kind of really revitalized the documentary form. I think Bowling for Columbine probably was one that really kickstarted a lot of other documentaries that kind of take off from his style or his sensibility, if not his philosophical approach to what's wrong with things. And one characteristic of his documentary is that it's not just a factual account of what's wrong in the world, right? You say that he's given you the big picture, which I agree. He's given you the big picture, but he's also presented that big picture in a highly performative way. Some might say exaggerated way. Some might say clowny way, a lot of buffoonery, right? Some might say dishonest way, because he's kind of telling half-truths and things like that. And so he his documentaries sets up the question, right? What documentaries should be, right? Should they really aim towards being just factual and everything 100% correct, or should they have the artistic license, right, to make certain things clear? And we talked earlier about that distorted mirror, right? So if you like the idea of distorted mirror, then a documentary by Michael Moore is kind of like a distorted mirror, right? It kind of collapses certain sequences, certain time, take a lot of liberties with time and things like that to suggest causality and all of that. So if you don't mind that, right, you want to see the distortion so that you can be clear what's wrong, right? What is the problem? Then then Moore's movies are fantastic for that, right? Because you get a really good bird's eye view of how different phenomena, even the most seemingly insignificant ones, can connect to tell us something very profound about neoliberal globalization. I mean, I don't think he uses this term neoliberal globalization, but I think that's really what he's getting at, right? The way in which, in American society at least, we're seeing a kind of post-democratic world where power really resides in the hands of the partnership between corporate leaders, billionaires, wealthy people who have, with their wealth, the ability to buy power, right? And so this kind of horrible partnership between technocratic leadership and wealth, right? Power and wealth put together, mutually self-serving and self-supporting, often at the expense of the people, right? And so when he talks about the healthcare system, when he talks about guns and violence in schools, when he talks about all these dysfunctions, right? All these dysfunctions in American society, you have that frame for understanding why. And if you just, in a sense, I mean, one rule of thumb is just follow the money, right? Yep. Where does the money take you? And that should give you a very good explanation as to why some things cannot change, even though everybody seems to want them to change, right? And that's, I guess, one of the perversions of neoliberal globalization, which is the concentration of power in the hands of the few, power and wealth in the hands of the few, and the distractions that we see in what looks like democracy but isn't, right? When you vote and all of that, I suppose one version of this account is it really doesn't matter who's the president, because it's the same, right? It's the same. You know, they will need campaign funding. You know, they will need contributions. They're going to be viable.
Yeah, the single biggest predictor of American elections is how much campaign money they have.
Exactly, exactly. So I think he's trying to get people to see this, and it's not easy, right? Because if you were American, you feel very proud of democracy, right? Your whole foreign policy is often built on ensuring that people you do business with or have foreign relations with comply with democratic norms and human rights. These are the things that make them feel proud of themselves. They're the bastion of democracy. So it's very hard for people to then question that, right? Americans to question that. Are you really that democratic, right? And can you sort of look behind the glossiness of democracy and realize that actually wealth and power have basically taken over a lot of the dynamics. So Moore's documentaries, I think, enliven this first chapter account of neoliberal globalization, the perversions of the extreme market, and the marketization of our views of everything, right? So it enlivens that part. But I also call him a working class hero, right? A populist. Right. And I do that very deliberately because I want to make a distinction between good populism and bad populism, right? And to me, right, I want to argue that that Moore is a good populist, right? Because he wants to, and he uses all kinds of methods, right, to do this. He wants to give the ordinary person a voice, right? He wants to empower the ordinary person to to be enlightened about what's gone wrong with society, and to feel optimistic enough to step up and vote, right? Which is something already we have, cannot take for granted. And beyond voting, to act, right? To act together and put enough pressure on their politicians who are in a position to make changes. So that's, to me, good populism, because it is kind of, in a sense, having a healthy regard for the people and making sure that the needs, the will and the voice of the people are audible and actionable, to contrast with bad populism, right, which is the kind that also targets capitalism, but does it in a particularly manipulative way. I want to call this authoritarian populism, where there are lots of unhappy people who had a very hard time in extreme capitalism, and globalization and all of that. Their lives are difficult. You kind of also know that they don't really understand why. They haven't got a theory about what's wrong in their lives. They just experience bad things, hardship, right? So this is a perfect space for manipulation. Come in with a simple theory that the elite, the liberal elite who are in power, have screwed you, right? Basically, by opening up the borders and exposing your country to globalization and foreigners and so on. So target the establishment. Whatever the establishment might be, just target them. They are the cause of policies that have made your life very bad. And the establishment includes not just political leaders and all of that. It also includes experts, scientists, and all of that. Target them, right, as these elites who don't understand, right, and who are making life very bad for you for their benefit. And target or channel their aggressions and their frustrations towards minorities, particularly foreigners, right? And tragically, sometimes it's even the weakest of the foreigners who get targeted, right? The ones who are victims themselves, right? So it's like almost a system that casts victims against victims. So there's that. And then other minorities, of course, that are the subject often of moral panic, right? Racial minorities, sexual minorities, whatever, right? As somehow being the cause of, the threat to our way of life, making our country, our society bad, so we've got to do something about them. And this is very easy politics, right? Directing people's anger against these very simple targets. But as easy as it is, it's also highly destructive, right? It can go out of control. And And this sort of takes me back again to that Platonic account, right? Plato says that when you reach this state of democracy, if democracy isn't really democracy, I mean, he doesn't say it that way, right? But we, contemporary people in the present, reading Plato will say, yeah, it's not really democracy, but populism and anything goes and aimlessness. Then you have someone who, with a charismatic personality, coming and theorizing this in a destructive way, in an anti-pluralist way, in an anti-minority way, anti-establishment way, creates a narrative that excites people into a crowd, right? A kind of crowd that is very difficult to control subsequently. So I want to contrast More's good populism against this bad populism. In fact, one part of that chapter compares and contrasts Michael Moore with Donald Trump.
Right.
They're both working class heroes, right? But profoundly different.
I should say just a quick one that regardless of what Trump seems like, he's very friendly to the establishment. So he's not at all anti-establishment.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You want to add something in?
I love Michael Moore's films.
Yeah.
Actually, as a piece of trivia, there was a person I've worked with. He was actually one of the employees in the production company that I had, who became his main editor. Pablo Proenza. He started editing trailers for him, and then slowly moved up, and now he's editing movies for him. Michael Moore, was always like a big topic of discussion whenever his movies came out. We love watching them. One of my partners, filmmaking partners, he comes from a conservative background, and it was always interesting talking to him about Michael Moore's movies, because on the one hand he would admire his filmmaking, but then he also disagreed with his political views. Right. And it was because of that he would focus on the techniques that Michael Moore used that were manipulative. And it does make me think, do I just like him because I agree with his political views? And if I didn't, then the tactics that he uses would bother me a lot more than they would otherwise, right? And I don't know, you can sort of see, because of his success, then other people start using his techniques. So even here in Singapore, I'm thinking of a local case, Minority Voices, there's a website that features stories about minorities, and then someone who disagreed with the agenda, actually started handing them fake stories, which they would put on the website, and then they would use that to point out that, they obviously didn't fact check and whatever, right? So I mean, obviously it's a bit far-fetched to trace that back to Michael Moore's style of documentary, but you can kind of see how I don't know, it's a very gray area, and I think just because someone agrees with our views, we even more so we have to be very careful about what methods we use, because they can sometimes backfire.
You're absolutely right. I mean, a simple way to think of that is, do the ends justify the means, right? And we like the ends because politically we're aligned with them, then we don't mind the means so much. But then those same means can be just as available to ends that we don't like, or ends that may be more dangerous. So that's absolutely true. I think with the case of the migrant voices, right? Migrant voices and other such platforms where half-truths, untruths can find their way, right? And this is also a phenomenon of social media, I think, which has just amplified this, the importance of what you just said so much more, right? And I always say about this book that I'm not saying that the message being conveyed by these movies that I highlight are the truth, the messages are the truth, but these are movies that are ideal for seeding conversations, whether it's in the classroom or whether in family settings, or just kind of groups, right, of people who are trying to figure out what they can do. So a question like framed in the way that you just did is exactly the kind of talking point that I think Michael Moore's documentaries will be ideal to provoke, right? means ends, what is appropriate for a documentary. Should we have a different view of documentaries, right? That they're not necessarily factually true, and the overlap between a documentary and a feature film may be quite a big overlap, right? And productively ambiguous. Can we think that way? And if we were to think that way, then we need, again, a more movie literate audience too, who will not be fooled by a documentary because they think a documentary must mean 100% factual historical truth, when actually it doesn't necessarily have to.
So I can come in with this because, as much as I admire Michael Moore as well, but actually one of the last films he had, so it's a film that he actually executive produced, but he didn't write or direct or produce it. So it's a film called Planet of the Humans, and the person who made the film is called Jeff Gibbs. So if you two are not aware of the show, I'll just explain what the show is about. It was essentially arguing that renewable energy, biomass energy in particular, as well as wind and solar energy, are not as environmentally sustainable as they're portrayed to be. And actually the movie insinuated that mainstream environmental groups and figures like Bill McKibben are complicit in collaborating with billionaires or corporations. Now, I did watch the show. The show was so controversial, invoked so much criticism that actually Michael Moore and the guy Jeff Gibbs decided to release the show for free on YouTube. And I watched the show, and I'm very interested, obviously, in environmental politics, so I gave it a fair watching. And going back to what you said about techniques of manipulation, or that I could see that as well, like what the show was trying to invoke and sell. At the same time, I also felt like it has a right to say that message because it wasn't conspiratorial. It doesn't, to me at least, fulfill the criteria of a really, really outrageous conspiracy theory. It was more or less more like taking certain bad bits, negative elements within the environmental industry or renewable energy industry, and just kind of like highlighting that. But you can definitely dispute and argue about the facts and the accuracy of the arguments. So like I said, I think for me, like I sort of sat in the middle. I agree this show has the right to be made, but at the same time, someone watching it needs to really read the criticisms and the counter arguments as well. Now my question for you, because now we're on this topic, and actually this question I have for you just directly lines up with this. So look, when Michael Moore was famous, I couldn't find a quote, but I do kind of recall a Singapore politician saying that I wish we had a Michael Moore in Singapore. So I can't find the exact quote.
An opposition politician?
No, actually no. I don't believe it.
Really?
It is. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So my question for you is there even the possibility of a Singapore Michael Moore? Okay, that's number one. But number two, right? Actually, we don't even have to be too abstract about it because. So I assume both of you know about the movie To Singapore with Love, right? Which is a 2013 movie written and directed by Tan Pin Pin. And for people who don't know, it features 9 Singapore political dissidents who have been exiled. They fled from Singapore, and it's been banned in Singapore. Now, I found this quote from Prime Minister Lee. So he said, okay, about the banning of the film. You write a book, I can write a counter book. The book you can read together with a counter book. You watch a movie, you think it's a documentary, and it may be like Fahrenheit 9/11, very convincing, but it's not a documentary, and I think we have to understand this in order to understand how to deal with these issues. So I'm very curious from you, Kenneth, how would you address this argument? Like, hypothetically speaking, right, if you, say, sit in a government board, and you have every authority to decide, where to allow, censor, ban a documentary film, and you're reviewing a film, say, like To Singapore with Love, what kind of criteria would you be looking for, and what would be your take?
Well, I think if I were sitting on such a exalted board, I would the last thing I want to do is to censor it, right? To that extent, right, of banning it, so nobody gets to, or imagining that nobody gets to see it and exercise their own rational thoughts about it, or engage in discussion about it. The last thing I want to do is that. The ban, by the way, just to be quite accurate, it wasn't banned outright. There were just limits on where you
I think it could be viewed in very limited spaces.
I think there were some schools and, or university settings where the movie was, that film was shown. But I mean, the world we live in now, I want to say banning in general, right? In general, banning anything, it's not going to work, right? it's not going to work because it will find its way somewhere else. And in some instances where it's like there's a public health dimension to it, it may find its way into a place which is hard to regulate, right? It's a dangerous place that it goes to, and you're endangering people, right? By going to these dark spaces where they cannot be expunged, right? But if you don't ban it, right, you get more of an opportunity to manage that space of how people view it, what they think about it. That doesn't mean they're going to agree with what you say, right? But you can more or less help to shape the terms of the discourse around it, and present as to the best of your ability the arguments as to why you think that's skewed or untrue or even dangerous work of art, right? You have the chance to present this, and if people don't believe you, then maybe it's something to do with you, right? You should do something about yourself and not be so unbelievable, right? And of course, banning things over and over again contributes to your unbelievability, correct? Because you have something to hide, right? I mean, why would you ban something unless that was somehow very true of you and you didn't want people to know about it? So I wouldn't ban it because it would kind of signal that there's something very true that you don't want people to know about. I wouldn't ban it because you can't ban it. It will go somewhere, and it could go somewhere dark, completely beyond your control. And then you don't know what happens to that, right? You don't know what happens to that. And it can come back and bite you in an even worse way. In fact, that film is, just Google it. Okay, yeah. Comes in 4 parts. And I mean, generally, I also don't believe in ruling through ignorance, right? By withholding things from people, right? So infantilizing people so that you can treat them like children. Because sometimes that ignorance, or if you were to succeed in creating ignorance, or lack of knowledge, or whatever, you could lose control of that too, right? And that could go against what you want as well as leaders. So I don't generally believe that, you know, you should hide things from people. Much better to engage with people, and you build trust. This is obviously very difficult to do, but over time, you know, you become more believable. You have nothing to hide, right? You treat people as adults that can be reasoned with. You don't expect them to agree with you 100% or even 20%, but you treat them with enough respect. I think there's something in shaping the space in which we communicate with one another and have conversations that makes those conversations more powerful. Having conversations in a context where you don't want some people to know this or that, and you keep secrets, and you ban and you punish people who speak differently, and all, I think it's self-defeating. Right? None of that conversation is going to be believable. However much you want to invest in national conversations, it's always going to be a wayang, right, as people say.
Yeah, so I'm wondering whether you know about this, because it's sort of, it's the same thing as well that has happened to because you know, in one of your interviews, right, you talk about how there are certain films that have a more activist blend, right, and it's very important to watch this kind of movies as well because they represent, you know, communities or groups which are underrepresented. And actually one film that was distinctly banned in a Singapore film festival was this Palestinian film called Radiance of Resistance. It was banned in 2018 because it features this teenage Palestinian female activist whose arrest was made a symbol of resistance to Israeli occupation. And you know, IMDA cautioned, obviously, like the show is going to be skewed, biased, and it'll be divisive, you know, for Singapore's multi-ethnic population. And I think, you know, what you just said just now is kind of a good way of addressing, you know, should we really ban such films when they offer a alternative perspective? Yeah, especially when you talk about groups that are pretty underrepresented. Yeah. You have something you want to add in?
Yeah, I don't know. I think I was just really just zooming in on the Lee Senong's comment on that it was presented as a documentary when it is not, and I think that presumes that there is a clear line between what's a documentary and not. And I think one of the things you are truly trying to bring up is that these lines are quite blurry. I mean, you can question, like, you know, like what a documentary is and how far it can use fictional techniques
Absolutely.
in telling the story.
I mean, may not even have to go all the way to fiction, right? It's just perspectives, right? People have different perspectives, and they could all be true. Right? In that sense, they could all be true. It's just that perspective isn't your perspective. Right?
Yeah, I will always say that when it comes to questions of this, like, you know, ultimately is there objective reality that the newspapers, that a film can depict with 100% fidelity? I would say no. You know, it's more like, what do you prioritize as your goal, as your ends, your means? What do you consider more important? What do you consider least important, right? So in a film that's, just to give an abstract example, that's very pro-business, pro-capitalist, you know, they may not, you know, they'll put profit, right? Or they put this kind of economic measures as the most important thing to look out for, but they forget all the other important indicators, right?
Yeah.
So yeah. Now the second segment of your book, right, deals with corporate greed, and you review a huge, you know, array of films, you know, because these films deal with health, education, criminal justice. So I just mentioned a few that you talk about. You looked at Robert Wright, who was the Secretary of Labor under President Clinton. He made 2 films, Inequality for All, Saving Capitalism. You talk about Morgan Spurlock, Super Size Me, 1 and 2, which was about the fast food industry. Merchants of Doubt, which was about the addictiveness of the tobacco industry and how the industry continued to hide the dangers of smoking from the public. And this is also very relevant to climate change as well, climate science. And of course, the last one, which is actually the most recent, The Social Dilemma, which is on Netflix, and that deals with the dangerous impact of social media. So, before I ask you this question, right, let me ask you this, because you didn't talk about it in your book. Do you know of this movie called The Corporation?
Yes.
Right.
2005, is it?
Yeah, so there's 2. So 2003,
3.
and then there's actually a sequel that was just made 2 years ago. So it's called The New Corporation, the unfortunate necessary sequel. Now all these films, right, they all have to do with the power of corporations. So do you have like maybe a succinct message as to what we should take away from such films, you know, for people to take it off? Yeah.
Okay. I think in that chapter what I wanted to do was first to situate corporations in the sort of broader critical theory of society, right? What place it holds. That particular documentary, if I remember correctly, the Corporation in 2003, sort of explain the legal position of the corporations, right? As a person. Right?
Yes,
Corporation
yeah.
as a person.
So it's a person in terms of how it's viewed legally.
Yes,
At the same time, what they did was this very interesting experiment, which is they got a criminal psychologist to evaluate the characteristics, the legal characteristics of a corporation,
right. Yes,
and hence render a conclusion that is, it's pathological. Right.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
So I wish I had remembered that, because it would have connected very nicely to that final chapter, or the penultimate chapter in the book on using psychopathy, the psychopath as a metaphor for Wall Street, right?
Yep.
But I didn't include that particular rather early documentary on corporations, and I opted to use something more recent, a couple sort of holistic accounts of the place of wealth, leaders of corporations, wealth, and their relationship to politicians, particularly American politicians, right? And how they are able to capture the regulatory system that's in place, but in many ways enfeebled by just the influence, the sheer influence that corporations have. And once I was able to do that in the chapter, by again focusing on Robert Wright's, or the 2 documentaries that feature Robert Wright, then I could sort of think of what effect that would have on ordinary people, right? And we often hear, of course, the GFC, the global financial crisis, and how foreclosures mean that people, a lot of people, lost their savings and their homes and all of that, whilst corporate leaders paid themselves bonuses and basically did not learn any lessons from it. Right? That's part of the psychopath idea, right? But I wanted to also show in less extraordinary times what would the effect be. And so those documentaries spoke about fast food, they spoke about smoking, those documentaries
social media
featured, social media. And I think what's central in all of these things is the proposition that what's involved here is addiction, right? It's how corporations don't just produce things that are good for people to use, right? I mean, that is true to a level, right? That who wouldn't say their lives have been better with social media? Who wouldn't say that, right? We're now so well connected to one another. We can find our lost friends, and we can connect with one another from across the globe, and it's a fantastic thing. But once you bring in the claim that is made in many of these documentaries about manipulation by making people addicted to these items, whether it's the combination of macro food types in fast food, the visuality of fast food, right, and the targeting of children, for example, all these kinds of claims that are presented in the documentaries, or cigarettes, right? We know about the addictive qualities of cigarettes and how research that pointed to that was hidden for a long time and only exposed much later. And then, of course, social media, right? The various devices, the sort of physicality of scrolling, of refreshing a page, which is not so different from what do you call that?
A jolt of dopamine.
What do you call jackpot?
Jackpot,
right.
That sort of idea, right?
Yeah.
And psychology offers so much that is good for our self-understanding, but so much that is bad for how to addict people to certain what actions suggest certain pleasures and enjoyments, and how you can make use of these actions to perpetuate that feeling of a high, right? And I think if there's one thing to take from it is how so much of what we do every day that may not be very good for us, in some cases may be very, very bad for us, have to do with addiction. And addiction that these documentaries suggest are very purposely and purposefully put in place by corporations, right?
Yep.
In their effort to market and sell their product and generate a continuous, sustained demand for them.
Yeah, so one segment from the corporation shows what a corporation would do to try to get their product out. So they did a skit where their participants, I mean the movie is using like their own actors to imagine walking around the street, and they'll see like a water bottle that has an ad on it, or they'll see a poster, or they'll see this, all this subliminal advertising out there. And it's a very powerful segment of the film, because it makes you much more hyper aware that all these subliminal messages are all out there, pervasive, and that's all just meant to make profit. It's not necessarily there to make your life better.
Are you rebuking me for not including this?
No, I just wanted to just continue to heap praise on the show, because I think it's very life changing.
You're right. I wish I had thought.
And I was just to share a little bit, I was in Melbourne when I watched that movie, and the filmmaker actually did a sharing session, so I was there as well. So it was a very, like I said, transformative experience.
The corporation?
Yes, the
filmmaker.
corporation, yeah.
I met the director too.
Mark Egbar?
Yeah, his film was premiering at Sundance the year that I was taking my film there.
Right. Oh, wow. We've met him separately.
Yeah. And then we bonded over Burning Man, because he told me that he met his wife at Burning Man.
Right.
And,
Wow.
So he saw your film on Burning Man.
Yes, he did. Yeah.
Which is an anti-corporate.
Yeah. So we kind of aligned on the anti-corporate.
Dovetail, right?
Yes. The universe is wonderfully connected in some ways.
Yeah. Everything, everywhere, all at once.
Exactly. But I really like the theme of addiction. I mean, I think it's a big framing sort of lens for me when I look at the world, and it actually ties into something. And I know you want to take the conversation into features now, right? But kind of ties into that. And as I'm thinking about this theme of can movies save the world, like, I think we have been conditioned to want the reward, the dopamine hit, as you mentioned earlier, of all these different things, and movies themselves are very rewarding and are highly sophisticated ways of delivering dopamine hits. There's certain formulas, and you can see how people just like suck up Korean dramas, and that's all the dopamine system going, right? And I've had so many experiences where I've watched a movie that really changed my perspective or motivated me to become vegetarian or to do this or to do that, and then it would last 5 days. And then I would like just revert back to, you know, whatever I was doing before, right? And so, yeah, I am wondering to what extent, you know, have movies become such a commoditized product that, yeah, what we're really getting is just the dopamine hit, but then there's no lasting effect.
No, you're really right to point to that, and it's something that I kind of point to. I don't work it out fully, but I point to in the final chapter of the book, actually, which is, you know, to question the assumption that movies are in a position, or movie making is in a position to change the world, when perhaps it should look at its own internals, right? And to sort out its own dysfunctions and all of that, including the need to make profits and adopting methods to addict an audience, right? A continuous audience. I mean, there's so many things that are wrong with the movie making industry as well, right? And we know about we know about things like underrepresentation of minorities. So it's a particular kind of worldview that's being presented. We know about kind of, you know, exploitative and abusive behavior that happens in Hollywood. We know about Me Too. We know about, you know, all these sorts of things that, you know, at least should make us ask that question, before you change the world, can you maybe change your world? Right? And figure out what it means to addict people to, you know, more debased forms of entertainment, for example, that lock you into the same old, right? And as we move into an age of algorithmic choices and modalities, this will probably be more and more the case, right? So they will figure out what you like and give more of the same thing to you, a kind of addiction, I guess. But it's also an addiction that narrows the exposure and the ability to, you know, or rather the opportunity to engage with things that are different from what we're used to. So we're addicted to the same thing, and we keep getting the same thing because that's a sure way of generating a continuous demand for that product. So somehow or other, to expect Hollywood, which itself is corporation, right? Hollywood or filmmaking, right? Even indie filmmaking, your Burning Man, for example, may have been co-opted at some point to become a corporation-like conceit, right? That could be the case too. So filmmaking itself, in bearing these corporation-like qualities, we can't expect them to initiate these changes. Humane design, and, you know, kind of be compassionate to the people who use your products. I mean, it's a very difficult expectation to make of any corporations, right? But some of these documentaries suggest that again, it's the people who should kind of gain awareness through conversation, through activism, and all of that. Even small changes in their daily lives, right? Like, how do you control your access to social media, for example? Where are the off limits, and how do we put pressure on corporations and regulators to demand more humane design, to demand a design that isn't going for the addiction route? And that seems to be the suggestion. There has to be pressure from below. But, you know, this obviously isn't going to be a very simple solution, right?
Yeah.
So actually, going along with that topic, one about addiction, dopamine hit, and about, you know, can the movie industry change itself from within? You could say that. So this is outside the scope of your book, but we're going to talk about feature films, and, you know, your topic is obviously about movies that save our world. So we can't help but, you know, bring up this whole issue about other commercial films, other feature films, and in particular, I'm talking about the superhero film industry, right? And what I want to ask you, right, is that even if these films are entirely fantasy based, right, but, you know, to me, young people or fans of these movies, they generally receive some kind of moral message. It's very similar to about saving the world, right? And so, and of course, with idioms like, with power comes responsibility, and the Marvel universe itself, they're even trying to diversify and represent other minority groups, right? I mean, what am I trying to ask you is, do you think they are also trying to do their part to save the world? So that's one. So that's a one-part question. Then the other one, actually, just to go along the same line, is that because you talk a lot about like how, or we've been talking a lot about how, maybe films have this, filmmakers themselves maybe consider this special responsibility about what kind of voices they are bringing onto the screen, right? But we have at the same time this counter movement of commentators, political pundits, who basically reflect social conservatism, and they say there's too much wokeism in these films, right? Just to give you a very specific example, so one of Marvel's most recent franchise is actually this character called Miss Marvel, and Miss Marvel is basically a American Pakistani young superheroine. So the series is going to finish, I think, this week, and I've been watching the show, and I've been quite impressed actually, because one of the episodes they actually went back in time and to depict the partition of India from India and Pakistan in 1947. Because this is part of a family origin story. Now, the special thing I want you to note about this show, right, is that it actually received a lot of positive reviews from critics, but it also received what they call review bombs, meaning people review bomb the show because they find it too woke. So what I want to ask you is, what's your take on this, counter movement, and do you buy into the argument? What do you think is the tension here? Yeah. But you can answer the first question first. What is your perception about this superhero film industry? Do you classify them as also part of this movement of trying to save the world?
Yeah, I guess so much depends on what saving the world entails, right? So, again, I have no particular expertise in the superhero genre or the comic books and the whole universe of superhero. But it seems to me that a lot of this emerged out of like World War time, right? So Superman and Wonder Woman and all of that were really national heroes. I mean, well, obviously
Captain America himself was an icon of
But I mean, Wonder Woman wears stars and stripes, right? So all these things stand for American values, truth, freedom, justice. All these kinds of things are very clearly expressed in their person, right? In their costumes, in their taglines, and all of that. So saving the world, broadly speaking, I think these superhero, the whole superhero universe, has the potential to highlight certain values that may be conducive to saving the world, being responsible for others, and so on and so forth. They can do that, but we mustn't forget where they came from, right? Which is kind of a strong nationalist kind of starting point, right? With very clear sense of who's going back again to this the journey of the hero, right? So the whole sense of who's the villain here, who's the hero, who are being saved now. So at one level, I think there is that. Let's not forget also that the superhero figures and stories can be co-opted very easily in the interest of nativism. I don't know if they are if they are like that today. My guess would be maybe not so much, right? Maybe much more sophisticated. They are superheroes who can laugh at themselves, Deadpool and that kind of thing.
But let's take another example, right? Like, for example, one of the things that, like I said, this social conservatives criticize about is the depiction of, say, LGBTQ representation in even mainstream films. So right now we have, for example, this Pixar film, if I'm not wrong, it's Pixar, Buzz Lightyear, the character from Toy Story. And there is a scene in it where it's just a kiss between two women. And for that, the show is now, at least in Singapore, considered NC-16, if I'm not wrong. And in another Marvel show, so Marvel movies generally are PG rated, but because there is a depiction of one of the characters being married to another man, so they made that show either M18 or, should be M18, I think. Because barring just that scene itself, there is nothing else about the show that would be adult oriented. So what do you feel about such gestures? Do you feel like it should be less politicized, because obviously there's a certain agenda behind it about, like, young children cannot watch the normalization of LGBTQ lifestyles?
Here's the problem, at least with LGBT, right? So in Singapore, you're not even allowed to depict it in a neutral way.
That's right.
You're supposed to show how terrible it is, right? That it will end in some awful, right? I mean, someone dies,
social
or
rejection, basically.
right?
Yeah.
And yet, we say that we will change when people are ready. So it's that thing, right? People are ready when they
See more changes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
When they see that, they're like all of us, right? And they love, they hate, they get angry, they have flaws, as all of us do. And to sort of leave out the fullness of LGBT life, and to insist upon a one-dimensional depiction that is always disparaging and negative, will sustain that view that these people are like that, right? And how can we? And that just seems like, I mean. So where to make the change? Where's the lever?
Yeah, it's a classic chicken and egg question, right?
Yeah.
At some point, someone has to present, a spirit of change, right?
So Singapore, what is Singapore if not? At least this is the narrative we tell ourselves, right? A country that went against the odds, a government that was courageous enough to go against the grain, and turn this into the success story that it is today. If we took that seriously, we should do a lot more of this courageous work, right?
Right. Okay, I want to just throw us a free ball as to what we want to talk about next, because look, the other part of your book, right, you have so many films we can talk about, which I can talk an hour long actually. So you got The Joker, you got Parasite, you have The Platform. I really want to talk about The Platform a little bit because I have a question about that. But I throw it up to you guys. What would you like to talk about? Parasite, Joker?
I'm up for anything.
Okay, sure. So I think with let's talk about Parasite actually, and just to let our viewers know, Kenneth, you have this 30-minute long.
32 minutes.
Okay,
Don't
sure.
exaggerate.
Right, this close to half an hour long video essay where you narrate the part of the book about Parasite. So first, let me just share my feelings. Right. When the film came out, it really came out of nowhere. I knew about the director. I love his previous movie, The Host. But what I found very ingenious about this movie was the poster was kind of weird. The synopsis was very brief. So, when you go in, you're like not sure what to expect. Yeah. And then what I found in the show was that this really multi-blend of different techniques and genres and tropes. So there's a bit of dark comedy, suspense. There's even some bits to me that came across as quite horror. And there's obviously social satire as well. And what I actually want to bring up for our discussion is that, so what's interesting about the show is actually the public reception to it. Because the show, like I said, it's quite hard to understand, right? It has a very strange title, Parasite, and I found very interesting responses and misunderstandings about the film. Thankfully, Kenneth got the film right. Because I'm just quoting directly from you, Kenneth, right? You said that this movie is a brilliant or grotesque representation of what you call economic Darwinism, right? That the lines between the exploit and the exploited, victim and villain is very unclear. Everyone turns out to be monstrous, each one a parasite that feeds selfishly and greedily on others in this socially interdependent ecosystem. And essentially both the elite and the working class live parasitically off each other in interdependent ways. So I love that definition. But I just want to let you know, so on the internet there were a couple of viral tweets and threads, of rich folks just completely missing the point, and they thought that the show is only about the working class characters, and that Parasite just means, oh, look at the poor, they live parasitically, they're dirty, because there's a very strong analogy about smell, about dirtiness, unhygienicness, right? And basically the Kim family, which is the poor household, and the housekeeper, they are perceived to be the parasites. There was totally no reflection about the rich, which is the Park family in the show. So I guess my question to you is, what do you think explains this discrepancy? And why do you think this show did so well, right, compared to other movies, other feature films that may have tried to also bring in this topic of inequality and class relations?
Okay.
Yeah.
Good question. And I think it's an observation that will probably apply to any film, really, right? As in, we cannot assume that audiences will read a film in a particular way, because you know, the polarities can switch, right, depending on who you are. Right? Who do you recognize in that?
Right.
If you look at, if you watch Parasite and you sort of identify with the working class, right? Living in basements, and you may not live in a basement, but you live in something that, you know,
They live in squalors, for example.
something,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So then more likely you may take the position of a critical position against the elite, right? More likely, right? That you know they are completely neglectful of the rest of society. They are entitled. They take for granted the work, you know, the daily work that working class people do just to make their lives comfortable, and they don't even know. I mean, the wonderful scene where, you know, the lights are flickering, right? Because the guy in the
Oh no,
spoiler.
like I said,
Okay, yeah,
spoilers.
yeah,
We're gonna have
okay,
spoilers in Parasite,
Okay,
right? But
so the guy in the basement,
yeah.
sub-basement, is banging his head against the light to send messages of respect to the. And he has no idea. He thinks it's motion sensors that's failing, right? So there's a wonderful, I think, analogy of just the unknowing way. You know, so you know, the elite are not evil; they're just unknowing.
Yeah.
Right? They're just
Right.
kind of moving about in this entitled. You know, everything's beautiful. And works well for them, but they don't know just how much labor goes into that. So someone who's watching it, who's part of the social structure that produces that you know, contributes this labor that makes life beautiful for others, can feel for that, right? But at the same time, that person may look at the working, the family, right, in the basement, the Kim family,
Yep.
and they say, you shouldn't act like that. You know, there are other ways to do well in this society. You might want to work harder. So that's also a possible reaction, right? They disapprove of the guile and the deceit and the maneuvering that happens that way. So they may take that position too. So, you know, again, it's like it's very hard to imagine what the viewer will make of this, and the polarities can switch depending on who you are. So why is this movie so successful? Well, one theory could be it's a movie where everybody sees themselves in it in some way or other, right?
Yep.
And can feel morally justified, or can feel a kind of moral indignation in response to what's going on in that movie. So maybe the success of that movie is that it speaks to everyone in very different ways, in a condition which we all find ourselves in wherever we are in the world. So South Korea, no doubt, but this sense of a divided society, wealthy, privileged versus, you know, kind of hidden away, almost invisible, poor. That's something that you can see everywhere in the world, right?
Yep. Let me support that with the director himself, Bong Joon-ho, you know, answering that same question as to why does he think his film has, you know, an international audience and fan base, and he said, you know, essentially we all live under the same country called capitalism. Yeah.
Yes.
Do you have any feelings about the show you want to share, like takeaways or
Yeah,
responses to?
I like your response. I think one litmus test for great art is complexity, and that, you know, it's not one-dimensional. And in fact, I think any movie that actually sits out with the agenda of saving the world is probably going to fail, you know,
Doomed
because
to fail. Yeah.
you know, and I'm thinking of like great literature, you know, like the literature where the person set out to write a moral of the tale, like it became one-dimensional.
Yes.
Whereas, you know, when the writer is really just fascinated by characters and shows the complexity of each character, so that each person reading it can, you know, take different perspectives, which is what you're saying about Parasite. Yeah, those works are very powerful because I think they're just realistic. Because I think more and more in life, I just reject the idea that there are good guys and bad guys. You know, it's just it's really just much more complex than that.
Yeah. And I think gaining an awareness of how there aren't good guys and bad guys, but, you know, we might all be suffering, but suffering differently, or thriving, but thriving differently. I think movies like this, they also provoke discussion, right? And I guess I agree with you that a movie that is designed to save the world is doomed to fail, but a movie that speaks to different audiences differently, but kind of all sort of pointing to a problem that they can get around, right? I think is still powerful in that way. And this is one of those movies that I think generates discourse, right? And awareness. But that's sort of the post movie in a way. And that's, I think, what I'm generally trying to say with this book as well. It cannot just be the movie. It must be the sensibilities that are kind of turned on and off, and the feelings of injustice, righteous, or whatever, just those feelings that are unleashed, and then just the need to talk about them, right, to understand ourselves in the context of them. And I think that talk after is what's valuable and potentially in all these movies.
I'd love to riff of that, actually, because I've been thinking a lot about, like, John Berger. He's this art critic who wrote Ways of Seeing.
Yeah, Ways of Seeing.
Ways of Seeing. I think one of the points he made was, like, I mean, he was talking about paintings, right? And he said, if you take a religious painting and you look at it in a church in its proper setting, you have a much different effect than if you were to see a digital image of that painting on your computer. It's just different context, and context matters so much.
Absolutely.
And
a can of soup.
Yeah. And I personally feel a bit nostalgic for the old days of movies. I mean, even it's within my lifetime where going to the movies was a big event, and it was a public thing, and you would have, like, the big movie that everyone would watch, whether it was Terminator or whatever. And these days, where there's so much of it and it's all streamed and you're watching it in privacy, the context is so different. And so, in some ways, I am interested in this idea of, like, how can we explore, like, what is a more powerful context in which to watch and experience these movies.
That's really important. And I guess it sort of points to this idea of how ubiquitous movies are as well, right? So, I mean, at one level you're saying it's noisy now. So we're all watching so many different things, and we're being recommended so many different things, and it's hard to sort of connect and to discuss further things that we've seen. But at the same time, because movies are so available anytime, anywhere, it also means that we could organize around movies, right? And I guess what this book's also trying to promote is just more of a culture of people coming together, having seen the movies or watching them together, anywhere, anytime, right? And then having the chance to sort of create discourse around it. That seems like something also that's a lot more possible with digital technology, right? And then who knows what the metaversal possibilities might be too, where movies could be experienced together in 3D ways, or whatever it is, right? Or as in embodied ways or something. So I have a feeling that when metaverse comes more fully, that there'll be more possibilities for engendering the social viewing, the social possibilities of viewing and discussing around movies.
Can't say I'm too optimistic. I share your optimism about the metaverse.
Yeah, I mean, it's more like what's the word? Wishful thinking.
Right. Yeah, but like, even for me, I'm not too sure whether I want to see that technology even exists to begin with. Because I think there's something to be valued about us physically with each other. Instead of being virtually wearing a helmet. Speaking, through a headphone and stuff like that.
You're scared of.
I think there's something that can be lost through real human physical interaction.
Well, the Matrix gives us that.
So just writing on the same topic as well, right? Because you Unsu, you mentioned about how you are more and more interested in this idea that there's no good guys and bad guys. I think in the area of films, that is still nevertheless a very persistent theme, and that nevertheless is also very commercially successful, right? I mean, Star Wars to the Marvel movies to many other shows, even Terminator and the old blockbusters, they were very clear-cut. And so this brings to the topic of Joker, right? So this Joker was very unorthodox. It was very successful for sure. So I think nevertheless, what I'm trying to say here is that it does prove an exception to the rule. But the previous Batman movies have also been very successful in their own ways, right? Where the Joker is a very clear-cut villain, and I think, to me, it depends a lot on like how the film teases that out. Why is someone a bad guy? Even in, say, right now with in the case of the Marvel movies, you can see people compliment villain characters if they have a rich background. People want to see explanations of why someone's a villain. Yeah, so I think that goes into the heart of like people's search for depth and causality, you know, what makes someone the way he or she is. So yeah, and I think the Joker did that very well. So that's why people were able to give it a pass and say, oh, this is a good show, because even though he's supposed to be the bad guy, he's supposed to be the one we're not supposed to have sympathy for, but there was so much richness to his character that the viewer can't help but feel something, right? At least relate somewhat with what the character is going through. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the richness of the character, but also the social circumstances in which that character is formed, right?
Yep.
So the criminality of Joker speaks more about the society that he finds himself in.
Yeah, in particular, the part about the mental health aspect, right?
Yes.
So that's the part I wanted you to comment about. Like, you know, what do you think people should take away from that movie? Because it was clearly not just about him. There was also the breakdown of society. His counselor had that very iconic line, you know, they don't give a shit about us, right? So what do you feel?
No, absolutely. So again, you know, this is Gotham, right? But Gotham, that's meant to point to New York City in the 1970s, which was like the roughest time, I suppose. Right? A city that was bankrupt, and crime rates very high. So pointing to that sort of moment, but also telling us something about what many of the films that I talk about actually point to, which is kind of that Reagan moment, right, where and this is really one part of the neoliberal story, right, which is a kind of social disinvestment, that part of this idea that to maximize the market, you had to minimize the state, right, roll back the state. And of course, this was kind of half true, right, because the state didn't really roll back all that much. It strengthened itself, it beefed itself up to protect certain parts of the market, to protect capital, right? But it rolled back when it came to social services. And I think this film really points to that moment when there was disinvestment in a lot of the very vital social services that were available for very poor people in the kind of the commercial capital of the richest, most powerful country in the world, right? And that sense of so that's one thing that I got from it, right? This idea that you need the state to spend on healthcare. You need that, and Americans for a very long time have straight away associated that with socialism, which is a demonic word, a demonized word in their vocabulary, in their public vocabulary. So it's kind of fighting against that. But the other thing also is the way in which we need to think about welfare, not only in terms of the provision that the state makes, right? The kind of the institution of welfare, the funding, the programs and all that, but also that relationship between the recipient of welfare and the person who manages that welfare. And I think this film does a really good job of giving us a sense of what that interpersonal relationship is like. Because the reality for many people, including people who have mental health needs and all of that, that reality is often telescoped in that encounter that they have regularly with the social worker. No more than that, right? And it's what the social worker wants to do for you, can afford to do for you. It's what the social worker has bandwidth to do for you, right? I mean, it's one of the hardest jobs in the world, right? So to get insight into what a social worker can really do, the helplessness that they are confronted with, the hostility that they have to put up with, the advice that they have to keep repeating over and over again. I mean, that's very a very important insight, right, into the way in which welfare works, especially in a place where welfare is being rolled back in the interest of, in a sense, diverting state resources towards capital development, economic development at the expense of social development. So I love the movie for these little insights that it, of course, presented in a very exaggerated way, but it's in the exaggeration that we get a good sense of the dysfunction.
You want to add on anything? Or?
Yeah, no, I haven't seen the Joker, but
Oh, you haven't? Oh.
no, yeah. But just hearing your discussion, a little game came up for me of, you know, like you name a movie and then try to identify the civil activist group in Singapore that would show that movie. And immediately I was like thinking, Transformative Justice Collective should talk about the Joker.
Yeah, absolutely, right? So that's one hope that I have for this book, that it would help a lot of activist groups on the ground, just kind of more easy. I mean, I'm sure they know, they have a whole bunch of resources that they have, but that this could make some contribution to, you know, picking resources and materials that can help them generate more discussion and awareness and amongst the communities that they work with.
Okay, so I want to talk about this other film. I want to check with you, did you watch it, The Platform?
No.
Okay. So it's a very interesting film. I'll try not to spoil too much of it, because we don't have to spoil the ending, but I will definitely talk about the synopsis, the premise of the show. Okay, so I really like that you brought up The Platform. I watched that show. I want to say to viewers, if you haven't watched it, it's really not for easy viewing. It has depictions of gore, violence, cannibalism. But it's, as you say, and I like how you described it, it's a very high conceptual film about inequality, poverty, collective action and revolution, right? And I, you know, it wasn't until that I read your essay that I loved that the way you presented the characters and you talk about them, they actually are sort of paradigmic representations of certain philosophical schools. You know, someone's an idealist, someone's a realist, someone's a rationalist. So I love that you broke that down. But the other thing that didn't hit me until I read your essay was how this whole show was essentially a cinematic reality of John Rawls' original position. Yeah, so it didn't hit me until I read this and I was like, oh, this is such a great insight. So, okay, so for the benefit of Unsu, he doesn't know what the show is about, maybe you explain a bit of that, about that and why you think it fulfills, you know, John Rawls' original position as a cinematic, you know, thought experiment. Yeah.
Kind of narrativizing Rawls' original position. Yeah, so the premise of the film is there's this social structure, right? It takes the physical form of a tower that descends down into nobody knows. So many floors, and on each floor there is a hollow space in the middle, and through these hollow spaces a table floats up and floats down and then up every day, once a day. And basically on the top floor of this structure is a gourmet kitchen, right? And they produce
beautiful food.
Beautiful food, right? So it comes down for a minute or so, right? For a minute on each floor, and you eat what you can, but you cannot keep. You have to consume whatever you take, and then it goes down and goes down and goes down. Now that's a really interesting premise, right? Because if you're way down there, you're not going to have very much food, or food that has been kind of destroyed, right? So the idea here is on each floor there are two people, and every month the two people will be moved to a different floor seemingly randomly. So you don't know where you're going to be next month, right? And if your partner is for some reason killed or whatever, then you'll be matched with someone else. You don't know. People sign on to come into this place. So you know, in a sense, one of the things it points to is this Rawlsian idea, right? Of course, we know Rawls's project in the 70s was to rejuvenate the liberal idea and the social contractarian idea. So his question was, what principles of justice should we come up with, and how can we think about that? And he came up with this device of the original position, right? Where we're all
the veil of ignorance.
Veil of ignorance, right? So we can't see who we are. We don't know what we might. You know, we're disencumbered of all our physical identities and talents and knowledge and skills. And if we were to imagine this hypothetical state where you don't know who you could be in this world that you are designing, right? What rules for that world will you choose, right? And of course, he comes up with a couple of rules. But this system speaks to that as well, because you don't know where you're going to be next month. And so in that condition, what rules would you like to set up, right? Now it goes further, of course, because Rawls is it's a philosophical exercise. What the platform does is it also shows how difficult it is, even if you had the rules, for you to implement them. because who's going to comply with them, right? Depending on where you are in this scheme, no matter how much reason you use to explain it to everyone, the chances that everyone's going to agree in a social contract that this is the right thing to do, the rational thing to do, it fails. And so, I mean, to cut a long story short, what it also kind of shows is that you kind of need force at the end of it. You need coercion and even violence at the end of it for people to comply.
Yeah, so totally, what I was going to say was, yeah, to me, the most important point I think the show made for me is that, you know, when there's an opportunity, sorry, Unsu, you said there are no good guys and bad guys, right? But there will be some people who will take the chance to leech off what are supposed to be these common resources, right? And they try to take more than what they deserve. And so going along with what your point is, I think in society you always need some form of regulation. That regulation needs to be accompanied with force, right? Yeah, because sadly speaking, you know, I think what this show tried to show is that when you had good faith actors trying their best to use reason and persuasion to get everyone to comply, work together, because essentially that's why this show was kind of criticized as a communist film, because it clearly was sending out a message that, a message of egalitarianism. If we all tried to be equals, no one would starve, but many of the characters were not behaving that way. And yeah.
Actually, interestingly, towards the end, you know, it even gets further than that, right? It says, so at the end, they decide, okay, we're going to take charge of this thing, right? The two of them, the two heroes, get onto the table, and they stand on the table, and it comes down floor by floor, and they say, okay, no food for you, right? Because think about it, right? We're going to let those at the bottom get food, and then tomorrow you get some, and we can distribute it. We will manage it. So it's not even relying on them to like avoid the food. They will manage it. Kind of socialism.
Yeah.
Right? There's a kind of almost legitimate government, so withholding so that you can spread more equally. It doesn't work, right? So at some point they just give up and they say, okay, they took their rifle and they bashed the heads of people who were trying to get the food, right? So in a sense, almost saying that it's armed revolution.
Yeah.
It's kind of armed, violent. That's the only way to sort out society.
I mean, it sounds like it starts with Rawls but ends in Hobbes.
No, actually,
that's quite
it starts
good.
even earlier. It starts with idealism, right? So the guy who comes in, everybody gets to bring one thing. So the hero who signs up to this thing, he comes in and he brings one thing, a book of all the damn things, right? And the book that he brings is Don Quixote. Right. So what does that say? It says a kind of a visionary, unrealistic, almost mad idea of the world, and it's the chivalry of the world, right? So you know, very soon he loses his idealism, right? When he learns that the world doesn't quite work that way. And his first encounter is with his roommate, who is a realist with a very he brought a sharp knife. So sharp knife and Don Quixote de la Mancha.
Wow, fascinating.
Yeah,
I'll have to watch this movie.
Yeah, it's a really very fascinating film. Yeah, like I said, it's not doesn't make for easy viewing. It fundamentally sets up questions about human nature. Yeah, so but I encourage anyone to watch it. So moving from one violent film to another, let's talk, I think this is pretty much the end point of your book, which is cinematic zombies. I'll skip the part about capitalism since we talked so much about it already. And I understand from you that you love zombie films. I love them too.
You do too?
Yeah, I watch almost every and any one zombie film out there, and you reviewed a lot, right? From the Western ones like Shaun of the Dead, 28 Days Later, Dawn of the Dead, World War Z, Zombieland, and even the little known ones like Little Monsters, which I also enjoyed. You know, this is a zombie comedy,
and even that is not comprehensive. But there's so many.
Yeah, there's just so many out there. But I'm going to actually sort of not talk about those popular ones because there's so much you already said about them, and actually draw us to this point that you made about the Asian ones. Because very interestingly, you actually reviewed the Singapore, Malaysian, and the Indonesian zombie films. I did watch Zombie Pura. I think the others I didn't watch as much or at all. So, but there was something you did comment about. You were quite critical, basically, about certain elements of these movies. So just to paraphrase you here, you know, there's uncritical social commentary. It's full of like usual ethnic, gender, and class stereotypes. It's loaded with what you call conservative anxiety, repressed through laughter, because many of these films are trying to use the comedy trope that ridicules. So what I'm trying to ask you is, why do you think, in this case, maybe we're talking about the Southeast Asian film industry, why do you think we keep returning to these cliche tropes? Why can't we seem to get out of it? And why is South Korea doing so well with, like, say, a Train to Busan, or there's the other Korean zombie film, #Alive, and they don't rely on those techniques. What is it about us?
Yeah, good question. Good question. I'm tempted to say, right, we're a lot more racialized in Southeast Asia, so the kind of repertoire of racial stereotypes are very available to us. And when you want to make a film and you want some, I don't know, some high likelihood of commercial success, a lot of people coming to watch, box office, chances are you're going to resort to a lot of these easy stereotypes, right? And you can do a couple of things with them. One is you can actually deconstruct the stereotypes, right? You can use the zombie trope to basically, first of all, put the stereotypes on display, and then kind of shame the audience into recognizing their real world stereotyping behavior, right? So you can do that. You can actually use stereotypes critically, I think. Some zombie movies do that very well, right? They kind of make us imagine that it's some other thing, but then you realize, oh no, the zombie is me, right? And I am being critiqued by watchers. So they may play with recognizable stereotypes, but then they turn it around, and before you know it, you're questioning your own abusive, exploitative, socially unjust behavior, whatever it is. For some reason, we tend not to do it so much in Southeast Asia. I don't know why, right? So we're content with just putting stereotypes on display to get a laugh, right? And I talk about how there's this kind of there's a transgender woman character, who is obviously there to resonate very strongly with the idea of the zombie as this kind of unnatural change, right? And it's meant to draw our, at one level, fear, because gender is frightening, right? So our anxieties about gender, and change, right, which is terrifying, right? And change in the most grotesque kind, which is the zombie metaphor again. So where we have the chance to use the zombie for a progressive change, we seem content with just getting a laugh out of it and pandering to our own sort of, ontological anxieties, and that's it. So I don't have a theory about it, but maybe it's just political laziness, I don't know, or maybe it's a lack of political imagination, or maybe it's just the commercial instinct, right?
You could say anyway, these cliches and stereotypes that exist even in non-zombie films. Like I hate to have to say it, but Jack Neal's movies, even the most recent ones he had, like the one about the women going to army. I mean, just looking at the poster, you can see the archetypes that he has constructed. And then, of course, in his older films like Army Days, there were clear stereotypes made about certain ethnic groups as well. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, the formula is quite simple, right? The main character is Chinese and male, and maybe has a little bit of a flaw, but will overcome it and drives the narrative. Then you have like brown people, Malays and Indians, who are there either to create the feeling of fear or buffoonery, you laugh at it, decorating the space, right, for these quick laughs. And then you have like perhaps the villain is perhaps like a westernized English speaking something, right? Chinese, something like that.
That's us.
So these are patterns, right? Somehow they've worked, right? So if formula works, this is against Singapore, right? Singapore, we like formulas because they sort of bring instant success. And, so I don't know if this is enough of an explanation as to why our films are like that, but I'm sure it's one explanation, right? The commercial.
Do you have a take on this?
I don't think I could, offer any better explanation. Who has studied all these films extensively. I mean, I would normally just probably think of a commercial reason. I mean, I know for a long time, like let's say the Thai film industry has really struggled hard to break out of the horror genre, you know, just because it's the only genre of film that they can get financing for.
Yeah.
So,
But they did it well, though. I mean, they did good horror, right?
They did, but I think they're a victim of their own success, because once you have a few successes,
Yes,
then
you're right.
then investors just want to invest in the same kind of movie, right? And it's hard to break out.
You're
And
right,
I think for some reason the South Koreans really have managed to like diversify a lot more.
And they'll probably be victims of the same success and success formulas as well at some point, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, interestingly, the one Thai zombie film that I talk about here is quite inventive, right? It's part of an anthology film, and it was basically this idea of a van, right, that carries, you know, sort of trafficking, human trafficking, right? So these people were in this van, and presumably they were mules for drugs, drug mules, right? But they turned out to be infected with the virus, and they come out and they sort of kill the drivers, and then they run and escape into a town. And what a simple idea, but how inventive and how clever and how provocative, right, from the point of view of, you know, kind of human trafficking and drug as a infection of some kind, right? Drug as a zombie infection, right? So I mean, they can do it, right? There's something about Thais, I don't know. Hate to be essentialist about these things, but you know, there's something that they seem to be able to do really inventive, creative.
I mean, even their ads are superb.
I know,
they do the best
exactly.
ads. Yeah.
We should stop speaking in this essentialist.
Well, actually, I want to go there a little bit. So this is a bit off kilter, but you know, so just a few questions first. Have you didn't talk about it in your book, but have you watched Squid Game and the other Korean zombie film or series? Sorry, it's a TV series called All of Us Are Dead. Have you watched that?
I have, yeah.
Right. Do you have any just short takes on it?
Yeah, I mean, so
then after that, I have my main question for you.
Oh, sure. Squid Game came out shortly after I finished the text, so I would certainly have included that. I don't think it says anything very much more about what do you call it?
Inequality, class
inequality.
discrimination.
Yeah, but I would have included that, I think, in the text if it came out earlier, right? Definitely. There's so many delicious things about that series, use of color, and you know, wonderful. The other one was All of Us Are Dead, right?
Yeah.
All of Us Are Dead. Yeah, I saw that, and again, I think it speaks to a certain age group, right? And I think it depicts youth types brilliantly, right? So I think it's very relatable. Anyone in that age group or anyone who's worked with young people, right, will recognize these characters. And I think it's got very good, I mean, I don't often speak this way, but I think it's got very good moral sort of lessons that are not sort of straightforward and banal, right? I think there are good moral questions in that show, which I think is a good model for young people watching it. So I did enjoy that.
Yeah,
I did enjoy it.
Okay, so just this is two recommendations from Kenneth, right? To watch if you haven't watched Squid Game or All of Us Are Dead. So this leads on to my main question, because we're talking about now this essentialist discourse we just had, right? But I mean, I think there's something real about industries, right?
Yeah.
So you're now living in Hong Kong, or you're teaching in Hong Kong. You know, 20, 30 years ago, the Hong Kong film industry was brilliant. There were so many good films coming out of it. We had our big stars, Chow Yun-fat, John Woo, you know, etc. And now look at the state of the Hong Kong film industry now, right? It's quite sad. It's quite disappointing to see where it is now. And then on the other hand, you got South Korea right now. You know, basically, I think at the top of the hierarchy when it comes to the Asian film industry. You know, the Greater Asia region. And I'd like to probe your brains about, you know, why do you think this is the case? What do you think explains why South Korea has phenomenally, you know, rise to the top of the charts when it comes to filmmaking? You know, great stories, great techniques, you know, production values, etc.
That's a really good question. I don't feel fully equipped, because it's a question a lot of people address, right? And they do it very well. But my own sort of intuitive response to that is, I think obviously the films are part of a broader movement, Hallyu, right? The kind of Korean wave, which includes pop music and other things as well, which was also sort of had the benefit of two things at least. One was what are they called? Chaebols, right?
Chaebols, right.
Those corporations, and
family corporations, right?
Family corporations that didn't just make washing machines and fridges, and they also invested in these industries too. And there's a very significant amount of private sector, right? Private sector resources that went into very significantly into the development of these industries. The second thing, and I'm no expert in this, right? But my sense is that the government also exercised a lot of protectionism. They put quotas on foreign films coming in, and in order to protect local films, right?
I'd like to add to that. One of the things that South Korea taught me about free trade and globalization, because this was when I was still very young, and I remembered that they were going to have a free trade agreement with the US, and there was this huge uprising from South Koreans against the free trade agreement because they were very afraid of the invasion of foreign media products into their economy. And it speaks a lot to what you said, like they were very protective about it, and they wanted to ensure that their local economy was thriving and it's protected.
Exactly. And it's actually not difficult to do because you can do that economically, right? With economic motivations, but you can also get support around it by talking in cultural terms, like the authenticity of local culture. We have to protect. When you speak that way, it doesn't sound so crass, right? so I think that I believe the industry thrived partly as a result of these kinds of policies, and then I think they probably were able to organize themselves, and this goes against the usual theory, right? Which is they really organized themselves as an industry, right? So they had these companies that would recruit talent and train them to such a high level of expertise. I mean, almost brutally, right? So one way to look at that is that's a sure way of kind of killing off talent through over commercialization, the boy band model, right? The Stock Aitken and Waterman kind of style of making music, right? So you will create a lot of hits, but after a while, it's like just formulaic and
but with the rise of, with the success of BTS, I don't know, man. I think
I know, right? So it's something else, right? Something else is going on here. So there is the cultural industry thing going, right? They're a well-polished machine. They're brutal. It's very competitive, and they know it, right? And anyone going into that knows it too. That you have to really, really work hard at their craft to do well. So there's that. Then there's that X factor, whatever that is, right? Is it that they're coming up with some people tell me that they love watching Korean series because they're so inventive. The stories are so original and creative to them, right? The concepts, although there's so many coming on stream, each of them seems to have an original concept, and people like that type of originality. I guess there must be something to do with just beauty, right? So the cult of visually beautiful people on screen, and that must be enough of a magnet for audiences as well. So I guess it's a bunch of all these things. Then of course the natural question is, for how long, right? And if you sort of think of Hong Kong in the 80s, then what is it, Japan in the 90s, right? And then Korea for quite a long time now. So they seem to have gone beyond what we think of as natural lifespans. It's no longer the decade of South Korea. Is more, right? So it's be interesting to see how long this lasts, right? And what comes after Hallyu.
I will add 2 points to your stream of thoughts. I think two reasons I think why they're so successful is because going back to the director of Parasite, right, Bong Joon-ho, like when I read his interviews, he's a very populist guy actually. He's very much similar to Michael Moore. Like he participated in protests and student revolutions, and you can see, you know, he has such a rich background, and I think this speaks to, and you know, South Koreans are have very democratic attitudes, public attitudes. They have after all protested and kind of overthrown a president. I can't remember which particular year, but they have that in their history. So
2016, I think.
yeah. No, actually something much more recent. I think in somewhere in the 2000s, they definitely had this moment where there was huge protests in the streets. There's way too many people up there who didn't want to see this president up there, and he had to resign. So that's that, you know, that kind of democratic public sentiments. And then the other thing, I think, going back to what you said about, you know, why do they always have so much original stories? So I don't watch every, you know, obviously South Korean TV show up there, but the ones that I've watched, the ones that I really feel are very good, they know how to tap into their rich traditions and culture, history. You know, obviously Korea is not a, you know, just like every other society, has different, you know, dialect groups, ethnic groups, and language groups, and they know how to tap into that huge reservoir and bring that out and still make it understandable to a foreigner.
I guess Kingdom.
Kingdom.
Zombie
another one, right? Right. Like how
period film.
Period film, zombie, right? And they just thought of like, hey, why don't we put zombies in, you know, in the Dynasty era, right? Like
it could tank.
Yes,
right?
it could have tanked. It could have,
The
that's
idea,
right. Yeah. So I think that's what they got. I think that's their strengths. So you know, maybe we're going to come to a close. So I just want to ask you a few more questions.
Okay.
So basically, leading on from what we just talked about, do you see any hope for the Singapore film industry?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
You mean to be what?
To be vibrant, to be dynamic.
So
can we have our own Michael Moore? Can we have our own Bong Joon-ho? Can we have, you know, someone great that would really like know how to draw on what, you know, Singapore has in terms of its own original cultural values and ideas?
So I think Singapore's film industry has been vibrant. I think it has, right? Probably not popular to say this, but I think there's been a lot of money available also from state funding and all of that. So, you know, from that infrastructural support system and all of that, I think things have been in place since the 90s, really, right? At that time, it was really EDB and all of that was, you know, really the pushing the film industry in a sense, partly with a view to trying to get post-1997 Hong Kong talent to come to Singapore. So, you know, there's an economic basis to it, so you can understand its authenticity in Singapore, right? There's an economic basis to it. So I think there's been a good support. There are venues, there are grants and funding and all these things where the applications are not so onerous and so on. So it's there, it's in place. We've got great people who come up, right? That first wave of, you know, Eric Koo, Jack Neo. I mean, in spite of what we said about Jack, he's a success, right? Yep. He's a great success. Every year, 2 or 3, you know, 1, 2, 3 films, and they make money. People like them. Now we're saying there's we're saying boomer generation like that, right? But whatever you might say about it, there are enough people who have supported. So he's a great success. Jack Neo, and then at that time also we had, you know, younger ones who were coming up, Royston, Tan, and all of that, right? Who were making these very beautiful short films and occasionally a feature film, you know, very sensitive, not only to just storytelling, you know, but also music, the sounds of Singapore. So we had that sort of, and then that generation also, you know, you had like Tan Pin Pin, who was, you know, sort of starting to become more visible, right? Making incredibly sensitive documentaries like Singapore Gaga, and then Invisible City, and, you know, all these things. And she continues to make these very sensitive and complex works. And, you know, and there's a lot of good stuff that's been produced, right? So what's wrong, right? So what's wrong? I think number one, we as local audience don't give it a chance. So we you know, so we come with that lens that is second-rate stuff, right? And we watch is just to support, right? Rather than to, you know, kind of assess the work on its own merits and all of that. So I think there's partly this overcoming. There's this, I mean, should I even say this? I mean, there's a certain kind of self-loathing in Singapore, right? And we always think our own are not good enough, right? I don't know where it comes from.
10 minutes.
I don't know whether it comes from a kind of a neo-colonial kind of whatever, right? But we have there's a self-loathing. Our own people cannot possibly be good. So there's that. Number two, I think sometimes the censorship regime may not be helpful, right? In the sense that it may engender a certain kind of self-censoring, or if it censors indiscriminately, then you have people sort of making films with that expectation, you know, that some parts will be censored. Then it kind of distorts the work, right? People always have to walk this minefield, right, in order to make a film. So I think that heavy-handedness of censorship may have something to do with it as well. But you know, I have every confidence that at least, you know, inventiveness, authenticity, and all of that, we've got really good stuff. Will it be industrialized to the level of South Korea? Probably not, because the mass, what do you call it? The
Market size.
The market size,
Right.
and you know, all those kinds of things are not there. Which is why I guess at one point they were really thinking in terms of co-productions and collaborations as the model, right? I'm not sure that worked very well, because we, as usual, right, we ended up being the supplier of money and you know, but the talent all came from elsewhere. So I don't know. Kind of my rough response to your question.
That's a good answer. Unsu, you want to add in anything before we come to a close?
Yeah, I don't know. You know, it's a tough question. I hate to be essentialist, but this is something I've often thought about. I mean, like, if we take a country like Switzerland, do we ever think Switzerland's going to be a great filmmaking nation, right? Like, not really. Somehow it's a stretch, because they're just known for certain things, and you know, maybe there's something about Switzerland, its predictability, its safety, its routineness, that goes counter to, you know, being able to make great films. And there's something I feel about Singapore that it's going to make it challenging. You know, just the fact that it is safe and it is very predictable. I mean, that's what we excel at, right? And I mean, one thing that I think impresses me about Korean films is just the intensity. You know, the range of emotions that they explore. And so yeah, there might be something about their society that really gives full range to that and embraces it. And you know, and I feel, I mean, there's not, I don't think it's impossible for us to get there, but even before we think about like being a filmmaking country, I think there's so many different arts that feed into films. I mean, I've often thought of films as the flagship of the arts, because every artistic craft goes into it.
They used to say that of opera, right?
Yeah.
Opera was the
Exactly. I mean, whether you're making sets or props or music or costumes, and so we need to cultivate all of those more basic things before it can feed up into like great films.
No, I think that's a great answer. Like, there's so much more that we have to work on as well before we get to that pinnacle, right, of you know, a vibrant, dynamic filmmaking. You know, state of high state of affairs. Okay, so I have one last question. It's for both of you as well, so feel free to answer it. And it's a quick one, because we have to come to a close. So, and I hate it that I know that you don't like quick fire questions, but it's not exactly one, but I'll make it easier for you. Okay, basically, right, your book is called Movies to Save the World. So imagine you had to give a Best Picture award for Best Movie that saved the world category. What would you pick? You can just pick from the book. I mean, you don't have to like go through an insane library in your head. And for you too, Unsu. Like, and if you want to be even more nuanced about it, maybe you can have one for a documentary and one for feature film, which is the way they do it in the Oscars, right? Okay. So yeah. So
I'm gonna buy Kenneth more time.
Yeah. So buy Kenneth more time. Yeah. Go.
I'm gonna be a little cheeky. I'm not gonna name a film. I'm gonna name a director.
Okay.
Something he's been lurking in this conversation in the back of my head, and it's Werner Herzog. I really love him because he's so versatile. He can do documentaries and narrative films. Yes. And there's something about his take on life. Like he really is questioning how movies and media abstracting us from real life. And in his own career, he's always emphasized getting in there, like being in danger, being in the wild.
Puts his body on the line.
He puts his body on the line, and you know, in his film school for students, like he says, don't make a film if you are going to you know, protect yourself from life. You need to expose yourself to life. And so, yeah, I think for me, in this time of the world, we all need to develop that sensibility of getting in there and being wary of too much abstraction.
Yeah. No, that's a great answer. I have to follow that. So I'll be more banal in my answer. So I think, again, in the spirit of this book, I'll go with sort of that commercial kind of film with a popular reach, accessible to anyone, right? And I would pair, at your suggestion, one documentary and one feature. The documentary would be An Inconvenient Truth, right? Which I think, you know, has really had an impact in the classrooms and various places. And I would pair that with Don't Look Up, which
a feature film.
Yeah, it's a feature film. And I think they work together, right? Because one sort of unpacks the other in a way. So I would give an award to those two seen together in terms of what they potentially have the ability to, the awareness that they have the ability to raise. And also the actual impact, right? People talk about them, they use them in the classrooms, they generate a whole bunch of other films that are like them, or at least in the case of just Don't Look Up, they will, I'm sure, generate a lot of films in that mold.
Yep. Yeah, no, it's a shame that we didn't talk about Don't Look Up. I had it actually in the list of questions, but we were going on so well that...
Thank God you didn't, then at least I have something to say, right?
Yeah, no, but I support that answer as well. I think it's a great show, definitely one of those that you have to watch for what it's done to invigorate the climate justice movement. And especially one very particular thing I always praise the show for is that it echoes the points of view of climate scientists and climate activists who are frustrated with politics, with the media system for stifling their voices, and they really feel like this movie represented that for them. So yeah. And lastly, my last recommendation is The Corporation. You can find it on YouTube. Yeah, do watch it. I do think it's a great film for for my best picture, best documentary picture. Kenneth, thank you so much for being with us in this very long conversation. So again, everyone, the book is Movies to Save Our World. Please get a copy and support Kenneth. And just one last thing, what are you working on next so that we can have you on the show again?
Oh gosh, okay. I'm working on a lot of things, as you can imagine. I'm conceptualizing a second part to this, which will probably be called Leadership to Save Our World, great leaders in the movies. So it will feature, you know, US presidents and Gandhi.
Very interesting, you're picking fictional representations.
Absolutely, absolutely. So that's going to be something. But I'm also working on slightly more academic works. I'm doing a book called Sex, Drugs and Rock and Roll about vice regulation. And I'm writing a book on Singapore, actually, which the working title is Decadent Technocracy. It's exploring how Singapore, in spite of the success story that we clearly are, what sort of narratives of decline can there be, and what would be the implications of taking those narratives of decline seriously?
Okay, great. We look forward to having you again on the show when those books turn up.
Thank you so much.
Good luck, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it, and good luck to you and this wonderful work that you're doing on this show.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kenneth.
Goodbye, everyone.